Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Sorry, we got started a bit late because there were lectures until 6. Thank you very much for coming today. It's a really special seminar today because we have Ching Kwan Lee from UCLA here, and she's going to be talking about global China, which is a new notion, a new concept for me. And I heard about it from Carlos, and I'm really, really thrilled that she's here to explore this with us and for us. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and they're each going to speak for about half an hour or so, and then we'll be opening up for Q&A. So Ching Kwan Lee is a professor of sociology at University of California, Los Angeles. She's won so many awards. You can find her CV online, so that's how I know this. She's won so many awards for so many disciplines. It's quite something, it really is. But her most recent books are Forever Hong Kong, A Global City's Decolonization Struggle, Southern Interregnum, Remaking Hegemony in Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, Hong Kong, Global China's Restive Frontier, and The Specter of Global China. So that's just the recent ones. And today we'll be hearing about, I think you're going to be talking about global China as a framework. Yes. Great. So Carlos Oyer, many of you will already know, is professor of the political economy of development and our head of department at the here in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. He's a development economist by training. He has degrees from the Universidad Complutense of Madrid and SOAS as well. He has three main research areas: the political economy of development and economic transformation, agrarian change and development, and labor relations, global production and labor markets. He is going to be talking today. In fact, counts as the launch for his very new book called China for Africa's Industrialization ? Which you can read online and for free. And I do recommend it because I've read it and we've done some little videos about it, which we will shortly be sharing. So as I say, about an hour, half an hour each, and then over to you for your good questions and answers. Now, yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. We don't seem to have a clock here, do we? Shall I let you know when you're halfway, about 15 minutes in, and then you 20 minutes in? Yes.
Because this talk can be really long. And I understand this is dinner time, late in the day. So thank you for coming. I've started studying global China some 17 years ago, around 2007. And at that time, the topic of global China, when I told my colleagues that I was interested in Chinese investment in Zambia, I was told that it was a French and frivolous topic that, and by one very senior person in China studies, he said to my face that no serious or senior China scholar is interested in global China. And that was 17 years ago. And today, I don't think anybody would agree with that kind of assessment because the field of global China studies has really grown exponentially. And for various reasons, there are both demand reasons and supply reasons. Demand, obviously, because global China has become such an important, preeminent force in world development. There is a huge demand for knowledge about what China is doing around the world in so many different ways. That's the demand side. So policy people, journalists, academics, of course. And then from the supply side, we have seen not just China scholars, people interested in China doing global China studies, but also a lot of scholars, young scholars like many of you, who are not thinking of doing China studies because they think, oh, I don't have the language facility, I don't have any background in Chinese history. They were drawn to do global China studies and research because whatever they are studying, they realize that China is there. And I have some examples, but in the interest of time, I'll skip them. And so we are finding in particular also that as China becomes more hostile to researchers, whether you're doing surveys or ethnography or even archival research, people have to find other ways of studying China. And so global China studies is a very viable option. And so from this supply side, we are seeing a huge increase in scholarship focusing on China outside of China, China beyond the Chinese borders. And so here I just want to give a very brief definition of what global China studies means. What is global China? What is global China? Global China means China beyond the Chinese borders, studying China as a force of global development. And because the field is really interdisciplinary, it's a big tent. There are various fields of people who study this phenomenon. And therefore, there are people who, like me, focus on power, the different forms of power that the Chinese state uses to project its influence abroad and all the implications that follows. There are people who follow the money, corporations from China, investment, which I also have done in terms of China in Zambia. And there are people who follow people. So global China studies also involve the studies of migration of ordinary people, entrepreneurs, business people, so on and so forth, the diaspora, and how China governs the diaspora through transnational repression, which has become a very hot topic. So I just want to put it out there. Global China studies in terms of subject matter really covers a whole range. And people doing global China studies also come from various parts of the academia. So what I'd like to do in this very short lecture is to do a brief summary of what I see as the major strands or major approaches to this topic, and to suggest and to tell you a little bit about what we have learned from these studies. I can only do so very briefly because of time, and also point out some of the major weaknesses that I think we should try to think of improving on moving forward. So I'll be talking about two bifurcations in the field. Let me see. Okay, so the two bifurcations, one is between the grand and the granular, and the other is between global China and the rest. So let me talk about the first one, the grand and the granular. We learned a lot of things from both, from all these approaches, but there were problems as well. So the bifurcations of grand and granular, oh, sorry, oop. Okay, I'm repeating it. Okay, the first one. What do we mean by grand and granular? The grand approach means that people study global China from above. They are interested in the aggregate, the structure of trade flows, the investment patterns, in the IR relation, international relations across regions, between China and different regions, diplomatic forums, and development finance institution, loan distribution. And these are usually undertaken by political scientists. Sorry. They look at the macroscopic picture, and it's usually policy driven. And so every time Beijing issued a new kind of term, oh, I can do it myself. Yeah, thank you. Each time Beijing issues some new terms to describe the policy, like Belt and Road, what else? Belt and Road, digital Silk Road, ecological civilization. These terms that are policy names end up becoming the titles of academic articles. So that tells you how people look at global China from above and basically elaborating, amplifying elite and official discourses and their grand strategies, and therefore do theorizing from that perspective. And we can say that this is a kind of seeing global China like the state, to use James Scott's memorable term. Or, they think that elite and the state and state policies determine what global China is and what we should be looking at. From below, the opposite is that there are many anthropologists who pursued this granular approach to global China. And instead of seeing like the state, we could say that they see global China like the village, in the sense that they have produced a lot of locality-specific case studies. They pursue microscopic process, agentic analysis, relational analysis, process-driven, looking at ordinary people, their everyday practices. They're very grounded in various, and there are numerous locations where you can see the operation of global China as I define it. It could be corporation, it could be the state, it could be people. And we got a good view of the granular dynamics, the relationships spawned by this phenomenon called global China, the interaction. And the implicit theoretical argument there is that we should look at these micro-level relational phenomena, and they combine to become global China, which is a very variegated phenomenon that cannot be captured by just looking at structure and institutions and elite policies and grand strategies. They distrust this grand strategy and ask, oh, so what, how do grand strategies realize themselves on the ground? And so the causal primacy in this school, in this approach, lies in looking at specific people. And I think these two approaches have their respective problems. The one about from above usually give us more hype than reality, or more ideology than reality. And they're very empiricist in the sense that they're very descriptive. And I'll explain it a little bit later. And the other side, from below, other problems emerge from this group of literature. They take a tunnel vision, what I call tunnel vision of global China. Also very empirical. They describe very well the granular details of particular road built in Ethiopia and the interaction between manager and labor and the government. But how they don't answer the question of relevance. How does that, whatever that happens on that site, tells us about other places? So there are these bifurcations, these two at least, and they each have their own problem. I'll give you examples of what we find using these approaches in a moment. The other bifurcation that I find problematic is the one between global China, studying global China and studying the rest. What I mean by that is, empirically, people doing global China studies, they are so focused on China outside of China that China is and remains the singular focus, even though their field site and the object of their study has moved beyond the Chinese national borders. They're ignoring the rest of the world. It's a very strange phenomenon because you think that, well, you moved outside of the China and you're looking at China in the world. But in the study, all they can see and all they focus in the research and collect data about is really Chinese behavior, Chinese people's behavior, corporations' behavior. And so China is the only country, almost as if China is the only country in the global arena. They forget the rest. And this is just empirically untenable because anywhere you go in Africa, let's say, as I did in Zambia, the first trip I made to Zambia to look at the copper belt, which would become my field site for the following 6 years, 7 years. The first thing I realized, I was so shocked because I've been reading so much news about China in Zambia. I thought China was the only player on the copper belt. But actually, along the same one road, the copper belt, there were the Canadians, South Africans, the Indians actually owned the largest mine, not the Chinese. Of course, the Chinese were there. But all you hear in the news, and the focus is so singular on China that actually it misrepresents reality, not to talk about theory, just empirically unfounded. And so this is empirical bifurcation to separate China, global China, from the rest that actually shape what global China is doing, whether it's in the way they mine, whether in the way they treat labor, how they interact with the state. All these, China does not determine what China does. It was determined by a whole set of factors that needs to be highlighted, but people don't do that. Another way of separating global China from the rest is what I call conceptual or theoretical bifurcation, because they focus so much on China from the rest. They really decontextualize China when they try to explain China's behavior. They decontextualize China from global forces. They think that Beijing is the mastermind of global China, and then the explanatory scope or the diagram only reaches so far as Beijing. But Beijing is not the final maker of global China. What about global forces like capitalism, like neoliberalism, like autocratization? If we think China is autocratic, well, the whole world is witnessing a process of autocratization, and China is learning how to do autocracy from the United States. For instance, in Xinjiang, where do they come from? The anti-terrorism rhetoric and all these digital devices that are installed in Xinjiang, they came from US-based, Western-based technology firm. Some of them are university-based research results. So securitization is another global trend, geopolitics, rivalry. I mean, all these are global forces that shape China. And so by conceptually, theoretically, taking China out of the explanatory domain that are, where all these global forces are working on different countries, we are missing the global in global China. So the global in global China should not be just about geography, or should not just be about an empirical subject matter. It should be about a way of theorizing China, and it should be a way of taking China's studies from the problem of methodological nationalism. That is, you only use the nation state as the framework of explanation. But if you single China out of all these other forces and what I call the rest, you end up repeating the same error of methodological nationalism, even though you move your empirical research out of China. Methodologically, theoretically, we're committing the same problem. Okay, so these are the two bifurcations, the grand versus the granular, global China versus the rest. I'd like to shed light on some of the positive findings, things that I find fascinating from the field of global China studies, despite the fact that there are these bifurcations, which I'll come back to in terms of proposing solutions to overcome them. Okay, so the people focusing on elite, grand strategies, and international institutions that China participates in, the from above group of literature, what have they told us that I find to be very significant when we want to understand our current global situation? There's a paradox, if you look at that literature as a whole, that China, that the West like to point to as like an evil source of power and repressive and everything else, China was actually a progressive force of change in the world stage. It's not regressive, it's regressive and repressive at home. But if you look at global China as an actor on the world stage, it is actually pursuing a lot of progressive agendas. It is quite the reverse of Western hegemony and colonialism. Western hegemony and colonialism is they're liberal at home and repressive and exploitative to the rest of the world. But China is the opposite. China is very repressive. I don't need to explain to many of you at home. But if you look at it globally, actually, it is the major player and promoter of some of the most important consequential progressive agendas. For instance, in the global economic order, and here I'm citing people who study China's role inside the World Bank, IMF, and some of the financial institutions that China creates, like the AIIB, the Asia, I forget the full name, it's AIIB, it's China-led multilateral development bank. And what they have done, what China has done, is fundamentally changing the rules whereby these financial institutions make loans to the third world. Now they are back to doing infrastructure as well as green infrastructure. Previously, the World Bank has lost all interest in making loans to infrastructure. China's presence in these institutions, and I don't have time to go into detail, you can ask me in Q&A, but they have basically changed the rules on how these institutions make loans, the conditionalities of these loans, how fast they approve the loans, how do they deal with environmental standard, which countries in IMF, which currency and countries, how much representation they have, which currency get converted into the IMF special withdrawing right, SDR, yes. So these are fundamentally changing what? Changing the political bargaining power of global South countries. And China was spearheading this kind of restructuring within these institutions. They are trying to redefine how these institutions see development. In the past several decades, these institutions see development in the sense of poverty reduction. That's the very important core goal. China has shifted that whole orientation to growth-based development, very different paradigm. And so this is a very important shift. And then in global environment and climate domain, China, it was spectacular. Just in 15 years' time, 2009, Copenhagen, China was ridiculed and criticized as the major polluter to the world environment. 15 years later, China's agenda basically guide the conversation on ecological civilization and how to do environmental and climate protection while the US have withdrawn. You know that. And so the third example is the global green transition. And this is going to be even more dramatic in terms of reshaping geopolitical order as we know it, because China's role and is undisputed. China is now the major green, the exporter of green technology and energy. And what it means is that is moving to and bringing this global south along with it. Many southern countries have 90% or so of the power generated from the electricity and solar and all these renewables away from fossil fuel and petrol state. So we're seeing geopolitical foundation, energy-based kind of geopolitical order shifted from petrol states to electro states. And China and the global south is a major transformer in this domain. And we'll see like 10 years from now, geopolitical order will be totally transformed because of China's role in leading this green transition globally. And one thing to note is global China may be an autocrat at home, but in the international domain, it is a preeminent multilateral actor. In all these cases, China does not act alone. China plays the role of a leader of a gang, of an alliance. So it's a group, is a group player, a game together with other states, with the global south. And I think we're facing a very depressing world if you look at the north, but there are a lot of very exciting future-oriented fundamental seismic shifts in political economy. If you look at China, what China is doing globally with global south countries. And in terms of all these three domains, China is a group player. And what they are doing is leapfrogging and not catching up with the West. It's a new strategy. They don't want to go perfect their combustion engine kind of cars, but they want to quit that race and open another race. And they're redefining so many things from scratch. Definition of human rights, 5G, you name it. What is the problem? Well, we learn a lot from this literature that look at from global China from above, from the elite, from all these grand strategies. What is missing and unknown and what I think need to be filled in terms of gaps of knowledge is why, how, and by whom. China, who, why? How did China pull this off? And what are the terms of the alliance? Why are global south countries following the footsteps of China? What is that relationship? Who come up with these great ideas? What are the class alliances that are behind all these shifts in green technology transition? What kind of state bureaucratic, technocratic capacity allow the global China together with global South to pursue these progressive agendas. We know nothing about that. So no, the literature only tells us what China has done, but not the processes and the why and the how and by whom, and the forces that allow all these, and the interests, the alignment of interests. So there's a huge gap, and from above, you can't really penetrate these processes. We need to tackle the kind of granular, actor-oriented approach at the level of empirical evidence. From below, what we have learned for people doing granular studies of global China, well, we learned very important lessons that actually China and Chinese actors are not as powerful as we assume. A lot of people assume, oh, Chinese state investors, they get their ways because they have money, and all these weak African or Latin American states, they don't have their own interests. They're just beholden to China as a new colonial power. We hear all these arguments all the time. But if you take the granular view and look at these studies, they tell us that there are many failed projects. And global China is not always a success. Global China is open to negotiation, and Chinese companies and government officials, their policy change due to community pressures. BRI projects are have seen as much failure as success. And so a lot of these Chinese projects do not obtain the result that China or Beijing wants. For instance, there's very good studies about Confucius Institutes as a kind of soft power that China wants to realize. But guess what? Many African nationals go to Confucius Institutes to take Chinese classes, not because they're attracted to Chinese culture, but because they want to improve their job market opportunities to learn Chinese. So it's not about achieving soft power. There's no soft power that has been achieved by China. But there are many, many other examples. So, and then many of these BRI projects that the West blame China for creating that trap and as example, to show Chinese dominance. Actually, there are many conflicting interests within the Chinese system that actually make these projects quite unprofitable. There are many projects that got sabotaged or derailed because there are many actors within the Chinese system that work against each other. We only look at the large amounts of investment, but we never or seldom follow up to see the results. And Financial Times sometimes, do these 10-year review, and they review a lot of failure cases. And so from the ground up, global China is less powerful, less dominant. But the problem and the unknown that we need to fill, the knowledge gap we need to fill, and because these are ground up studies that do not take into account the macro political economic structure, they do not tell us under what conditions do you see success where China get its way, or under what conditions China does not get its way. So good conditions and the why in all these variegated phenomenon. So again, many descriptive studies showing a good, some aspect of global China that are very important, but there's no explanation. I think if there is one common feature in the global China studies literature is that there are many very rich description, very valuable, but we are very short in terms of explanation. And I'll suggest how we can go beyond that. Well, I'm coming to this point. Actually, I'm skipping so much, I'm losing my train of thought in terms of where I should.
Done about 20 minutes.
I have, okay, great. I have 10 more, great. So it's just good that I'm coming to the last part. Alternative to bifurcation. So I have talked about these two sets of bifurcation and what we have learned from the existing literature and what needs to be remedied. So what are the alternatives to offer more explanation and not just description, and to really put China in the global context rather than isolated it from the rest? I propose extensions in 4 different directions. One, there are 4 types of extension. The first is making connection. That is empirically not to isolate China, but connect China. Whatever you're studying, it can be Chinese firms, private, public, Chinese migration patterns, Chinese government policy behavior. Connect what your case of global China with other actors in the field, and they look at their competition, look at their collusion of interest, look at their collaboration, and try to sensitize yourself to look beyond China empirically. And then analytically, what I would suggest is to make the micro-macro linkage. And this applies to both people looking at global China from above. For them, is starting with the macro, but link up with the micro. Look at the real people who are making those policies and where their ideas come from, what kind of power, what kind of interests drive those policies that end up changing the rules of the World Bank and the IMF. So for them, it's going from macro to micro. And then for the granular studies people, they should then build up, reestablish the macro structure, political economic structure of that particular village or that particular project they're analyzing to tell us under what conditions do we see the results that they document at the micro level. And so that's the first kind of connection. The second and very important is comparison. And I think this is the most difficult part, but also the most essential part to move the field forward. Is not just to look at China, but really design research that look at China, compare China with other countries or other actors from other countries, other interests from other countries that are in the same field of activities. For instance, I'm sure all of you have heard this complaint about the BRI loans for infrastructure building. China is setting up all these debt traps to make developing countries comply with its global agenda through these loans for infrastructure. If you only look at China, well, you only see BRI, and only China has BRI, right? So it feels legitimate. We'll look at that. Guess what? If you conceptualize this phenomenon, BRI, as economic statecraft, and you will find parallels of other countries not having BRI as their policy, but doing similar things, leveraging loans to change other countries' political economic system or try to have that influence. Good example is what the World Bank and IMF has done for so many years, using loans to impose structural adjustment. It is not called a BRI, but in nature, it's another BRI. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to compare China with these other similar kind of behavior. And then when you have comparison, you can tell us what is so unique about China. Otherwise, you are demonizing China because you only look at China, or you glorify China because you only look at China and essentialize that only China can do that. Only China would commit that kind of terrible things to other countries. So I think comparison is absolutely important. And to do comparison, we need to conceptualize rather than being empirical and just say, oh, this is a Chinese company. I look at them. I look at this company. This is Chinese actors. I look at them. We need to conceptualize what these entities are before we can do comparison, because without that kind of conceptualization, how do you know what to compare China with? So migration is another hot topic for people studying global China because people are easier to approach as study subjects than companies or government officials. So there has been a huge literature on migration or diaspora. But diasporic governance is not unique to China. Many states, since the age of globalization and neoliberalism, since migration becomes a global phenomenon, many countries have developed their own policy, some very repressive, some not so, to govern and leverage diasporic activities. So if you look at Chinese diaspora, you should also compare them with other diasporic communities and strategies of governing in order to, again, highlight what is Chinese about China. This is a blind spot that I've been talking about China studies. People study China and assume whatever happens in China is Chinese. It's not. You find the same thing in other places. But the China studies field never questioned that. They never push scholars. They publish things that equate China with Chineseness and then uniqueness. And then we have these China studies that are really untenable at that level. Circuit. Circuit means what? We can extend the study of global China through circulation analysis. That is, trace global China's effect back and consequences back to domestic China. This is a circuit, it's a circle. And we absolutely lack study that track the consequences of mass migration, international students coming to the West and then return. What kind of impact do they have? Companies that make money or have huge losses overseas, what do they have on the Chinese economy? Global China is the result of overcapacity within China. What does all these 20 years or so of overseas expansion do to this policy, this problem of overcapacity? Have we solved the problem of overcapacity, or has all these global China activities exacerbated China's problem? So we need to extend our analysis, bringing global China back to where it comes from and assess this whole phenomenon for Chinese development, but also for global development. And lastly, this is my last point, theory. It's very eminent. An eminent and salient weakness of global China studies is the lack of extension from empirical data collection to theory. We need to think of Chinese phenomena through theoretical terms so that we can employ and benefit from social scientific literature that talks about, that offers many general theory about economic development. When you have China as investors in Africa, we have tons of previous historical examples where foreign investment can do all sorts of things to a developing economy. Why can't we use those theories to examine China's work in Africa? A lot of global studies scholars forget there is these general theories that we should use to look at China. Just because they're looking at China, they would forget about the general social science, as if China doesn't, it's a special magical land that none of these applies. Migration, tons of literature on migration, on economic stagecraft, symbolic domination from Bourdieu. And China, of course, is not the only kind of, as a matter of China tries to learn from other countries on how to do soft power. But very few people use soft power as a theoretical category to look at the Confucius Institute or other tools of symbolic domination. And then, of course, theories of colonialism. If we are serious about thinking whether global China is a new colonial power, let's do it seriously and not just rhetorically to condemn Chinese influence. Everything becomes colonial or new colonial without serious engagement with all kinds of very rich theoretical repertoire we have on studying Western colonialism. We should deploy those theories. And so this is why, and I here want to commend Carlos on his work, because his work that he's going to report actually illustrate my points about extension very well. He has comparison, he has theory, and connections. And so it's just a natural transition to Carlos. And I want to highlight the fact that his volume is part of my series in Cambridge University Press. I hope you will check out all the titles under that in that series. And a lot of the things that I report just now actually came from authors of that series. And it's a great resource for people interested in global China. And with that, I want to hand it over to Carlos to present how we should properly do global China studies. Thank you.
No collusion. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating presentation, and I have to thank Ching Kwan for all her work in this field. As you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, trying to tick boxes. Am I ticking those boxes with this book or not? It provides a really good framework for self-evaluation, actually, in terms of the work that we've done. In this case, I mean, this is the book, but this comes from more than 10 years of research. And I have to say that Ching Kwan's work was initially actually quite an important source of intellectual inspiration for my research, and certainly for the writing of the book. And indeed also her persuasive power and strong encouragement to write this book was a critical factor, because I remember when she first approached me, I wasn't particularly sure whether I could deliver in that context. Anyway, so this is a result of several years of research, but as you can see from those of you who have had the opportunity to download, the free book is actually a very short book. And it is the outcome of many years of research. It's not my research. I've got plenty of people who've participated and contributed to a lot of the insights that are reflected in this book. I would particularly like to thank my co-researchers and friends who've been in that journey from the beginning. Florian Schaefer, who I think is somewhere in the room, and also Wei Chen, who probably is watching online. This kind of research cannot be done by one individual, and I think the book just reflects that collective work. But let me just give you a sense of, I'm not going to give you a long description and an explanation of the book. I'm just going to give you a bit of a taste of what the book is about, what are the key arguments and themes, and I think it's useful to look at them in relation to what Ching Kwan has presented before. So there's three issues I want to really focus on in this presentation. One is where the book begins, which is the aspirations and realities of industrialization in Africa, the arguments for industrialization, why that matters, the obstacles and opportunities. That would actually, I had a longer chapter, had to be squeezed. So it's condenses plenty of insights and themes there. And then there's obviously global China, which is one of the key aspects of this book, and the key mechanisms of the contributions, both potential and real contributions that we can find to Africa's industrialization aspirations. And the third thing is the importance of agency and context, and that we go down to the granular and we connect all these, the macro and the micro. Primarily through a contrast between two countries that are particularly important to understand Africa-China relations. Ethiopia and Angola are probably the two countries in the African continent that have received probably the highest share of loans and development funding, as well as investments into different sectors. So they are particularly relevant, but they're also relevant because they're very, very different. And the way these relations unfolded and the kinds of connections and interactions and relations were really very, very different. So there's some premises before I dived into the main arguments of the book. So this is really not just about China and Africa, like many of the studies in this field, but really about Africa's legitimate right to development through structural transformation. And the book makes a particular case for industrialization-led structural transformation. It is also a lot about variation in outcomes. Variation is central to what the book presents, and we try to look at the determinants, whether it's variation in the drivers and outcomes of foreign direct investment coming from China and other sources of variation in labor outcomes. And I'll come to this point later. Then, unsurprisingly, the book rejects methodological nationalism. I don't need to explain that, but also it rejects another form, another syndrome, which is Africa essentialism. Looking at Africa as a sort of unit, and not really considering seriously the huge differences that exist across countries and even within countries at times. And rejecting these two traps is fundamental to avoid the kinds of superficial narratives that sometimes we find in this field, but also in other fields. The book is based on extensive secondary research. It does draw on the wealth of new empirical studies, especially over the past 10 years. There has been a huge expansion, as Ching Kwan was showing. And a lot of that material is actually very, very useful for the material for the book itself. But also it relies on, it draws on several years of primary research. We started the first project in 2015, and then we sort of chain all the projects, two other projects, linked to some of the issues that were found in the first project. So one first point of the book is to engage with this big question in a relatively short chapter, which is why and how to industrialize. So this draws on a traditional, well-established literature in heterodox development economics, historical political economy of development, which I'm sure that a lot of students at SOAS are sufficiently familiar with, from Kaldor to our colleagues, Hajun Chang, Arkebo Kubai, and others in our department via Amsden. So these lineages, provide plenty of arguments and insights onto the question of why and how to industrialize in contemporary capitalism. Interestingly, this is an ongoing debate. We still have plenty of well-known scholars like Danny Roderick, who argue that the industrialization path is dead, that is no longer viable for most countries in the global south, and those who disagree with him. So it is a very important empirical and theoretical debate. The argument that the book makes is that industrialization does matter for structural change, and in fact that most successful experiences of structural change, even in contemporary capitalism, are somehow in many different ways related to industrialization efforts. The question is how and for what purpose, because that can vary. This is where we see different outcomes across countries. Structural conditions certainly matter, but do not always determine the pathways. There's this sort of excessive pessimism that one finds in the literature at times is very much driven by these considerations about, these or that factor is missing, and that therefore there's no chance for this country to develop industrial capabilities. And in order to avoid that sort of excessive determinism, we need to account for policy and agency. But policy and agency also need to be theorized and understood in terms of the kinds of configurations of power and context that facilitate the emergence of leaders and policies and technocrats that are interested and capable in producing the outcomes of an industrialization plan. And this is where Hirschman's possibilism and Amsden's anti-determinism influenced this book a lot, like it has influenced the work of many colleagues who are also present here, like Chris Kramer and Jonathan Dijon. Last week we had a great seminar on Hirschman, and that reminded me of many of the things that I also wrote about in the book. So when it comes to context matters, and it's important to forget about China for a moment and say, okay, well, the industrialization in Africa, what are the key stylized facts? And I'm just going to summarize some of the key points here, because this is really a big debate. There are different views and different kinds of narratives that we find, those who argue that what we've seen in most of Africa is premature industrialization, basically because the basic preconditions for industrialization were not there, and some of the experiences, for example, of the 60s and 70s, which is not viable and not sustainable. There are also those who have very much articulated this narrative around premature deindustrialization, focusing on what happened in the 1980s and 1990s and the ravages of neoliberalism and structural adjustment programs and how that basically ended the industrial dream of many African countries. There are also those who say, yes, there is industrialization. We do find examples, but it's thin industrialization. It's really not particularly deep. Industrial ecosystems are not created. There's just a few countries merely specializing at the lower end of industrial tasks in global production networks, which is this kind of current configuration that characterizes these efforts. And, Mauritius is often used as an example of that. Contrast that with, what I would call contingent industrialization. In fact, when you look at the various experiences from the 60s through the 80s, Mauritius, then onwards to the latest examples, we actually find all kinds of different paths, some combining in import substitution industrialization, some trying to go for export oriented industrialization, sometimes without coherence, sometimes with a coherent plan, but no resources. So there is plenty of contingency that characterizes these efforts, particularly if we look at the last 20 years. Now, when we look at the aggregate stats, and this is always a problem when statistics are not particularly reliable, and particularly if we look at aggregate stats for the continent, there's two ways of looking at the reality of the last 40 years or so. One is that, industrialization as a share of GDP is going down, therefore there's no hope. Africa is not really industrializing, if you look at that in relative terms. But if you look at what's happening in real terms, in absolute terms, you see that the last 20 years have seen a clear revival in industrial development. So there is something going on. It is going on in different places, in different countries, and it's worth paying attention. So these over-pessimistic narratives have a problem when looking at individual experiences and countries. So this graph, which is a bit cumbersome, but basically what tries to show is this variation in outcomes and paths. And particularly interesting is the contrast between two very different countries in Africa, Ethiopia and South Africa, South Africa being the industrial powerhouse, and where you can see in the trends for the last 20, 25 years, not doing very well, compared to Ethiopia, coming from a very low level and practically no industrial development, shooting off and almost following the sort of relative path that you see in success stories like Bangladesh or Vietnam or other East Asian trajectories. So that's something that also is encapsulated in that analysis in the book, where I try to make sense of these variation in outcomes. Now, the other particularity of the book is that it's not just about states and firms. It really brings labor back into the picture, because when you look at industrialization as a global historical phenomenon, it is not just a form of economic transformation. Industrialization comes with very deep social transformations. The well-known labor surplus transfer from agriculture to industry comes with all kinds of tensions, frictions, and conflicts. In some countries, these sort of transitions happen over incredibly long periods of time, generations. In other countries, they happen very, very fast. And that's why China has been characterized as an example of compressed development, where kinds of things that happened in over 70, 80 years were squeezed into 20, 30 years in China. Now, what we see in many African contexts in the last 20 years is this infrastructure boom, which is partly associated with Chinese actors, and also manufacturing enterprises coming in, and also some domestic manufacturing enterprises emerging. All these create new jobs, and particularly for two groups that are quite relevant for the book: youth and internal migrants, people migrating from rural areas into these fast urbanizing regions of Ethiopia, Angola, and other countries. These new jobs, they all come with new skills, which have to be learned, new forms of organizing production and new forms of organizing labor. What some people say, new kinds of work cultures. And actually, this is a very old issue when we look at the development of industrial capitalism in Europe and beyond. How these work cultures were created, how they shaped the social transformations, how they were contested and negotiated. That's something that has happened historically in every single place that has gone through industrialization processes, but there is variation also how different groups of people react to that. So that means that when we look at these, you will find, it's not surprising to find instances of conflicts, resistance, all kinds of struggles. It is a process that is long, protracted, and certainly not frictionless. And that would have surprised some of Ethiopian policymakers when they were trying to understand what was going on in the industrial parks. But certainly what was going on in those industrial parks was not necessarily very, very surprising. So all that happens in a context where we have deep employment challenges. Unemployment is not the most important one. Underemployment is a key one, but especially low return insecure employment, the working poor, some people call them. A youth bulge without a demographic transition, which means that in some countries we may be seeing a demographic dividend, but in other countries, some people worry about the demographic boom. And that, therefore, jobs and the creation of new forms of employment is absolutely critical. What we've seen also, partly because of the connections between African states and external partners, especially since the 1980s, is a very alarming lack of prioritization of more and better jobs. Something that is partly been reversed recently, but certainly not the center of policy agendas. So these are some of the actors, some of the people who are part of these processes. I mean, these were workers who participated in the surveys that we conducted in Ethiopia and Angola. All very different kinds of workers with different experiences, very different origins, doing quite different things, whether it was building roads or working in apparel firms. Now, going to the main issue of the impact of China and Chinese actors on these aspirations to industrialize, what are the key vectors? And these are some of the vectors that the book tries to unpack. I would say that the key ones are infrastructure finance and building, connected with the nature of that finance, being patient capital finance, with a direct and indirect connections with manufacturing investments. That's two that are interconnected. Foreign direct investments, mostly private industrial investors from different parts of China, who come with new jobs and skills in manufacturing and construction. And then linked to these vectors is the access to suitable and affordable technology for particular industrial sectors that are more likely to gain some competitive edge in African contexts. So these are the realities on the ground. These kinds of things have happened for the past 25 years or so, in some periods in fairly accelerated path, in some countries far more than other countries. And of course, there is, a discourse of industrial cooperation that has been used to frame and package a lot of these things that are happening on the ground. And this is something that we see particularly since the FOCAC Forum of 2015, when the Chinese government, Chinese authority realized that actually one way of distinguishing these kinds of flows and relations from the rest, the kinds of external relations that many African countries have, is frame it in terms of sustained industrial cooperation and letting African countries embark on industrialization strategies. So what are the most effective mechanisms and why? I can't give you all the answers to these. These are very big questions. So I'm just going to focus on 4 key vectors. So the first thing to note is that industrialization takeoff, this is something we know from history, but also from contemporary experiences of industrialization, is not really possible without substantial but targeted infrastructural development. There's a whole debate now, for example, on whether you need to electrify the whole country or not only certain pockets in order to achieve industrialization. So there's 3 things that are absolutely fundamental in this respect. One is power generation. There has been a lot going on over the last 20 years or so. Low electricity costs and secure, reliable supply to factories are absolutely central to any industrial takeoff. Whenever we interviewed company managers from different firms, not only Chinese, we did comparison, so firms coming from Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, etc. They all say the same. Why do you invest in Ethiopia? Low electricity cost, access to reliable energy. That is the precondition. Otherwise, we wouldn't risk it. We don't care about the low wages if we're going to have power outages. Transport and logistics are particularly important, especially the latter, if you need to export. This is absolutely central. And regional markets may become increasingly important outlets for these industrial enterprises. And last but not least, dedicated industrial parks and hubs. This is something that's interesting, very much promoted by China, partly because following their own example, but it's something that some governments have also assumed as an important part of the industrial framework, industrial policy frameworks. So this is just a very recent document from the African Union, the OECD, highlighting the point that I mentioned before on the absolute centrality of electricity for industrial firms, and particularly in African contexts, more than other contexts, and also transport as seen as a major or very severe constraint. So a lot of these actually would explain the investment dynamics into this sector and certainly the lack of investment, private investment from different sources, national as well as international. a lot of this is happening with, as I say, patient finance that is has been delivered on different terms, where long-term horizon is more acceptable, where the kind of cost-benefit analysis typical of the World Bank and other development banks, it doesn't really rule the way these loans have been given. And the second thing is that it is patient finance, but also finance that has been particularly targeted to these key infrastructure needs. I mean, Africa's infrastructure deficit is well known, but particularly in these areas. So 60 to 70%, depending on the year, of Chinese finance, official finance, has gone to power and transport over that period of 2022. So China has certainly, in the space of just 20 years, in some countries even less, become one of the leading funding sources, if not the leading funding source for energy and transport in a growing number of countries. The other phenomenon that is happening that is also important to pay attention, and the book does give some evidence on that, is the vast expansion of Chinese contractors, mostly state-owned enterprises, which have become actually leading firms in the world of large-scale infrastructure. If you look at now the rankings, 25 years ago, there were 1 or 2 in the top 10. Now I think there are 8 or 9 of those firms in the top 10. A lot of them, the result of very significant mergers among different state-owned enterprises in China. So they've gone from 10% of the Africa's infrastructure market in 2003 to over 60% in 2019. Now it's probably higher than that. And that also explains the fact that those numbers suggest that these firms are not just depending on Chinese finance. Actually, for a lot of these firms, the finance comes from the traditional development banks, particularly the World Bank, the European Commission, and African AFD, among other players in that field. So you can see that what I was talking about in relation to the allocation of resources, quite different from the kinds of allocation of funding finance resources from other players, especially the World Bank. You wouldn't see that in the World Bank, despite the fact the World Bank is supposed to have this comparative advantage. Now, the third element is the export of industrial capacity. And that requires an answer to the question of why Chinese firms invest in Africa. So the book goes into these, characterizes different varieties of Chinese capital. There's also quite a lot of variation there. Different types of push and pull factors. But one thing that a lot of the literature, including our own research, has shown is that a lot of these Chinese manufacturing FDI, many of which are small, medium enterprises, family-run businesses, tend to be more domestic market oriented. It means that they're really market seeking in a context of overcapacity in China. But also we do find examples of exporters, and global production networks where suppliers from China and other countries are reaching out into new areas for expansion. And Ethiopia is the leading example of that. So you can see that the FDI stock, Chinese FDI stock, has really remarkably grown, particularly before COVID. And examples like Ethiopia, where the largest proportion of that Chinese FDI was actually going to the manufacturing sector, unlike other sources of FDI in Ethiopia, but also in other countries, African countries. And the final point is, what are the key mechanisms? What are the most effective mechanisms in relation to agency and policy? And this is where the book, goes into some detail in the contrast between Ethiopia and Angola, the drivers of different industrial policy frameworks, the kinds of balance of forces that created the environments conducive for those policy frameworks to emerge. So there are several questions that need to be asked and for which we need evidence. One is the kind of political settlement that is more conducive to such efforts, not just for these efforts to arise, but also for them to be implemented on the ground. What is the capacity, for example, of these states to discipline different sources of finance? I mean, can the Ethiopian government tell the World Bank to not fund X, but instead give them the funding for industrial parks? The capacity to target investors themselves and to discipline those investors. Can we ask investors to actually focus on exports rather than the domestic market? What are the kinds of, as Amsden would call them, reciprocal control mechanisms that are needed for that? And are these politically viable in these different contexts. And finally is, what are the achievable targets? Are these realistic? And are these targets that can be achieved while avoiding a race to the bottom? That was very much a problematic that guided a lot of the policy thinking in Ethiopia, especially, but is not one that characterizes policymaking in many other African countries. So the book tries to illustrate these contrasts through this variation, through this contrast between Ethiopia and Angola. Ethiopia, in this particular period, 10 years of industrial policy experiments, which led to astonishing results, interesting combination of import substitution industrialization with export-oriented industrialization, building verticality by convincing global buyers to bring their best suppliers, and et cetera, all kinds of measures that actually paid off at least until 2020 when the political settlement started to crumble. Angola did none of this. Actually, Angola didn't really have a real industrial policy, that there were some papers, but not really one that was being coherently designed and implemented. But there was some industrialization happening in Angola, pretty much following the sort of exploiting market opportunities and the sort of import-induced demand that Hirschman used to talk about. You know, imports really tell you about the opportunities and what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. Anyway, before I finish, just a few words about labor and employment. And here again, we found huge variation in outcomes, huge variety of situations. And here's a few illustrations of that variety, particularly when we look at these two examples of Ethiopia and Angola. Different subsectors. Ethiopia was the only one really that was developing an export apparel industry with leading global suppliers going into the country and exporting to very demanding markets. Whereas in Angola, it was basically manufacturers of building materials in a context of an infrastructure boom, which was created the demand for those. We find a large presence of young migrant women in those apparel sectors in Ethiopia versus larger male workforce in these building materials industries in Angola. Very strong localization of the production workforce. I mean, this goes against a lot of the early literature about Chinese firms and labor sourcing in many African countries. I mean, I think we contribute to debunk that myth. We did it before. I didn't spend too much space in the book doing that because it wasn't necessary. But it is true that there is a slow localization of the managerial workforce, which is a common problem. Again, going back to the comparison, it's not just the Chinese firms, it's also many other international firms operating in industrial parks. And then plenty of evidence of labor conflict, work culture clashes, which cannot be framed in nationalistic terms. It's not about the Chinese work ethos, it's really the industrial work capitalist ethos that characterizes a lot of these relations and frictions that we found on the ground. So let me conclude with a couple of thoughts. First, this book allowed me to, that was one of the challenges for me, to connect different themes in the political economy of development. By looking at China and Chinese actors in Africa, actually, it opened a window to talk about other things as well, and not just the kind of descriptive stuff that Ching Kwan wasn't very happy about. And part of that really is the centrality of bringing production and employment back into debates of structural transformations in Africa, but also any studies of Africa-China relations, and defend the art of the possible in policymaking. Now, to the question, as the book shows as a question mark, what is the answer to the question? Well, yes, global China, or the actors that are part of that global China, have certainly contributed to some efforts of industrialization in a number of places, but there is a lot of variation across countries, and even one could say within countries. It means that not all African countries and African governments are strongly pursuing industrialization, either willing or able to. There are different versions and different answers to that question. And that is a question that sort of is left hanging in the book. Why? Because agency matters. Our contrast might help how agency matters, but that requires a very granular analysis of the different circumstances in different countries in order to provide a more complete answer. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Would you mind just switching in a bit, because I'm just gonna chair your
Right there?
coming down. So thank you, those two went so well together, that was, I mean, purpose. Yeah, so we're gonna open to for the Q&A in just a second. Sorry, can I see you? Oh, there you are. Okay, yes. I will decide who gets to ask questions. So who would like to go first? We're gonna take 3 at a time. That's just a second. Finding 3. There's one there, and I think Jonathan at the back. Did you have your hand up? I did not. You did not. So sorry. Okay, that's great. So there's a woman here. Sorry, Poppy, just here. Yeah, thank you. We'll start here and then pass it along here and along there. Yeah.
All right.
It's nice if you introduce yourself so we know where you're coming from.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much. God, it's intimidating being the first one. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Alessia. I'm an independent researcher, but very much kind of willing to go back into academia and pursue global China field. But hopefully as a PhD student at some point. But yeah, thank you so much for basically summarizing a lot of what I'm reading right now and dealing with as I'm working on my proposal. I've been following both of your work for a while, so it's good to put faces to names. I have a question that is related to something that I think has been kind of implied in this talk, hasn't really been directly covered, but I know that it's something that one of the elements in the Cambridge series deals with, which is, I believe, global China as a method. And I know that Professor Oya, you mentioned it in your recent element too. I haven't yet had a chance to read that book, so I don't know what it means by global China as a method, but I'm curious to hear your opinion and what do you think about global China as a method and whether it's helpful to use terms like that. Because for me, I mean, as a political science, legal researcher, methods, it's something like quantitative methods, qualitative methods, and they're kind of the same as you go across disciplines or interpretivist methods. And whether you think defining China as a method actually helps or only exacerbates this bifurcation and exceptionalism bias that you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to go next? Would you mind passing this along there? It's impossible to get in and out.
Thanks so much. Hello, my name is Zhuang Han. I'm currently working at LSE as a research fellow, and I have been, Eli's one of my advisors, so I have been learning Ching Kwan's work. Eli Friedman has been my advisor, so I have been learning Ching Kwan's work from the very beginning of my PhD training. Thank you a lot for the great talks. So my question, the empirical part goes to Carlos and the theoretical part goes to Ching Kwan, is related to the cultural part, which Carlos touched on at the end of the lecture. I personally studies a lot about the 吃苦, the eaten bitterness, or the evolution, idea of evolution in China these days. And I was just wondering how that cultural idea of like mass competition have been influencing, especially on the labor market of the African country who's taking Chinese companies in. And I have seen a lot of news about labor resistance from the African countries and especially from the union, and they have been able to negotiate with the Chinese enterprise, which is really unusual at home. So I just want the theoretical part is for how this kind of resistance, the result of the spirit of negotiation, go back to China to influence the headquarters, the company's headquarters in China, or the overall evolutionary environment happening in China. That's my question.
That's 2 questions, but that's all right. We'll let you off there. I think there was one more on this side. Thank you.
What is the theoretical question? You have a theoretical question for her?
Yeah.
The involution, the or the nature.
So what is the theoretical question?
Uh,
You just mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So I just wondering from the perspective of global China back to China, how to think of it as maybe Weber's idea of spirit of capitalism, or how to understand it as a spirit of industrialization, maybe more properly.
Going back to what is going back to China? What is the thing that goes back to China?
It's that idea of like post 吃苦 post so okay, I'm a little bit trapped here. So that idea, when they go back, that spirit of negotiation out of 吃苦, when they go back to China, what kind of
Okay, so what you're saying is when they go to Africa, they have to adapt and negotiate,
Yeah.
yes,
right? And whether when they come back to China, they actually
what-
translate that
Isn't it
into
a boomerang?
changes. Yeah.
Like a boomerang effect,
Yeah.
but a positive one.
Okay,
Yes.
so does that happen?
Yeah.
So that's not
Yeah.
a theoretical question. Is it?
that's more empirical, but how can we theoretically understand
Okay.
that trend of going back?
Great.
Hello, I'm Ramsey. I'm a grad student here in the development department. And I'm wondering how both of you conceptualize some of the sourcing of foreign direct investment and view the influence of both the recycling of export surpluses in exporting capital abroad, or the exporting of domestic savings surpluses, given Chinese households' high savings rates. Thank you.
We'll take one to answer those three, whichever order you like. And then we're gonna go to the online.
Yeah. I think I'm going to leave the method global as a method to Ching Kwan, which is probably much more. On the work culture, I think yes, it is true that you have this, very strong competitive culture in China. I think it's also true that it has evolved, and maybe it wasn't always like that. There is a question around how work cultures change with the development of, for example, industrialization and industrial capitalism. Okay, and that's the thing I was trying to refer to. That when you look at the clashes of work cultures that are very common in the global China literature between the lazy workers and the Chinese managers, there's two problems with that sort of perception, which is actually a perception that is quite common among the managers themselves. When they go and they try to make sense of why they're struggling, very often they say, well, we have different cultures. The reality is that these are not national cultures per se. These are cultures that are dictated by the demands of globally competitive industrial capitalism. And those cultures will vary. For example, our contrast between the building materials industry and the apparel industry clearly show that the work cultures were not the same. The work environment in the building materials factories was far more relaxed than the apparel factories. And one thing that was clear is that the incredible pressure on apparel workers was very common across the board, whether the firm was Chinese, Indonesian, or Indian, right? Yeah, the things that would vary would be how high the supervisors would shout at their workers, how they spoke to the workers. That there were some national cultural traits there, but the demands in terms of efficiency, the demands in terms of work effort, etc., are essentially common to industrial capitalism. And these are the kinds of things that Thompson used to write about. The building of a working class in England in the 19th century, early 20th century. I've got plenty of examples of the same thing in Spain. And just to finish with that, I remember that once we were talking with actually it was an Indonesian factory manager about these issues, how you resolve these issues, which were leading to labor turnover and all kinds of problems for them. And he told us, I'm actually quite relaxed. I've seen this happening in Laos, in Cambodia, it just goes away after a few years. The good workers, I mean, you use this expression, the good workers stay, they understand the work culture that is needed in this factory, and those who can't cope, they go. And, eventually you get into this situation where, you get incredibly efficient workers in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, people who come from rural areas, from villages, and they were never used to this kind of work environments. So there's nothing national about that. I mean, I understand that China has a particularly competitive environment, whether it's for education or whatever, but that doesn't translate into these. So the firms actually need to adapt. That's true. And they adapt to, all kinds of demands. They don't like unions, but if the context is such that they have to accommodate them, they end up accommodating the unions in the factory floor.
Right. I just want to add on that, management culture, to me, theoretically, I think varies with institutional and political forces rather than something that flows from one place to another as if they are self-determining. So I don't agree with the idea that, you develop this kind of negotiable kind of culture, and then the managers just carry this with them when they go back home. I think my theoretical understanding of culture is always that cultural practices, in this case, in the workplace or in other situations, cultural practices usually need the embeddedness in certain institutional, class balance, political context. It's the context that shape what people do. It's not culture that becomes internalized into your head, and that transcends all institutional political context. I would emphasize that it's political institutional context that determines managerial culture. And so if the company moves from Africa back to China, you're changing the institutional and the class balance in the context. Carlos mentioned the context, and the culture will change. So the same manager would behave differently if you put him or her in different institutional political contexts. And so I don't quite agree that you acquire this habit, and then regardless of your interest and what you can do moving back to China, then you carry with it because the institutional political context would have changed. Global China as method, that's a term. I understand you got hung up with this method and methodology terminology. I think we call the book Global China as method, and if you look at the book, basically it argues what I just mentioned in my presentation, that we should theorize China not as a country with bounded borders, and we should put it always theorize China in the context of the global system, meaning that there are global forces that shape China. So in the book, the authors gave several examples, one of which was Xinjiang. So we point fingers at Beijing, saying that Beijing as the authoritarian regime put all these Uyghur people in internment, concentration camp. We only saw Beijing as the actor, but if you put Beijing into the global analysis or a global kind of analytical framework, you see capitalism at work in producing Xinjiang situation. Who benefit? Who buys those cotton made by those workers that were put into concentration camp? Those are the big names: Nike, H&M, all the made Victoria's Secret, you name it. So Xinjiang is not the product of China, although it is in China and it is under Chinese rule. But the interests that produce the human rights violation and the surveillance state in Xinjiang is not, you can't find everything by just looking at China. We need an analytical lens that really captures the collaboration and collusion of research universities in the West with a communist government. Capitalist market, those transnational corporations that benefit from the labor. So these are global forces, not Chinese. So what we say with the term method is really a way of thinking rather than how you collect empirical data.
Just, I need to go back to Ramsey's question.
Yeah.
I forgot. I mean, just a quick answer. If you're referring to the export of industrial capacities as a solution to overcapacity, and that is a common theme in much of this literature. I think the key issue that probably reflects also the excess savings in China. But in reality, I think for me, the key issue, this is likely to happen, is what drives a lot of relocation historically. So it's not particularly new. I think the scale may be new. Now, the only issue to say there is I think the big question for me is when a lot of those savings are not going to direct manufacturing investment overseas. A lot of those savings go to buy US treasury bonds and whatnot to sort of feed the financial system. I think the game changer will be when that changes, when a lot of that extra savings, productive capacities actually really start seriously relocating, particularly to the global south. And then we will see these as a counteracting tendency to, the effects of automation, for example, in industrial sector. That would question the sort of over pessimistic view that you often see these days about, this. It's no longer possible for all the countries of the global south to get into these industrial production networks.
So we're going to take a couple of questions from the online audience, if we can find them. Okay. Do you want to read some out? Let's read them from there. You need a mic, I think.
Okay, we've got a couple here. This one here. Okay. So what do you think might be the reasons behind such academic verifications? What does it tell us about how academia views China? Is the first one.
What was
The
the
reasons.
I'll repeat that one.
Yeah, and then the second part.
Yeah, so I can repeat the whole thing. So what do you think might be the reasons behind such academic verifications? What does it tell us about how academia views China?
Use China. Great.
Use China.
Use China.
Academic, you
Yeah. And the second question?
Okay, so the second one is China has also exploited the cheap resources in Africa for decades while holding the often corrupt governments ransom on the finance provided, like in Angola, Zambia, and Sierra Leone. I'll go again.
Is that a question?
It's got a question mark. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's not a question. It's not a question.
No.
Choose an.
Okay, we'll do it. We'll do this one. Given how important the investment on industrial park, good roads, and stable electricity supply are for structural transformation in Africa, how do you think African countries could still focus on these targets with the decrease of development finance from both China and the OECD bilateral financiers? Why is the fund necessary for these investments from? Where?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so should we take those and see how we go with those? We're already getting quite late, I realize.
Yeah.
And there's so many questions.
There will be more in the real audience,
Yeah.
and we'll come back. to
Okay,
that.
so maybe quickly, the reasons for that clarification. Well, I think it's, as I said, there are many different disciplines. People from different disciplines working on the topic, and I think they just inherit the usual perspective from the discipline. So IR people, and as we maybe if you read IR literature, they really focus on grand strategy rather than what's behind the grand strategies and who make those strategies and for what reasons and why. And so I think people just fall back on the usual disciplinary orientations. I'm a sociologist, and I have been one that have been trained to do explanatory theorization and rather than interpretation. I've been trained to do micro macro linkage and comparison and all of that. And maybe my emphasis on that comes from my own unique training, which I would defend on rational, grounds. And so it's not just because of my training, but because of the kind of opportunities that this approach would offer in terms of producing useful knowledge. But I think, that's my explanation. The bifurcation comes from The different discipline indeed comes with different emphasis. Anthropologists, of course, they will look at the interactional, the ground level reality, and the discipline just hasn't had this tradition to compel them to rebuild the macro situation of the particular site. So I don't know. I mean, this is
Global China then create a space specifically for interdisciplinarity, do you think?
it. Well, actually, many topics could be done interdisciplinarily. It's just that the field, because it has become such a salient phenomenon, it attracts a lot of interest from a diversity of views, and then people bring their own methodology and habits and approach to it. But my proposal is they can be improved if we really do interdiscipline in the sense that we don't confine ourselves to what we're used to. But you can apply it to studying India, for instance, or other global phenomena, global health.
Just on the last one, on the resource exploitation comment, my question, I think the thing to flag is what's remarkable about Chinese FDI is not that it goes to resource extraction like pretty much all other sources of FDI. Is that a significant proportion of that FDI goes to manufacturing. That is really the surprising fact. Pretty much everyone else tends to focus on resource extraction because this is really what's profitable. So it shouldn't be surprising, and just interpreting that as a sort of through the neocolonial lens is frankly lazy. On the decline, this is actually a very, very big problem. It is certainly true that the size of the funding from China, mainly from the Chinese policy banks, has been drying up a little bit, well, actually quite a bit during the COVID period. There seems to be a sort of reversal of that trend recently. It's just going back up again. But I think some of the recent literature on this topic, what it's suggesting is that there seems to be a shift away from very large projects that are, potentially more risky from the point of view of the creditor, towards slightly smaller, smarter type of projects. So that might have implications in terms of the kinds of things that get funding, and therefore whether large-scale infrastructure projects or the kinds of hydropower dams might struggle to get that funding because despite the fact it's true what Ching Kwan say that other sources of development finance from the World Bank and others they did wake up in the last 10 years and they started reorienting some of this finance towards economic infrastructure. That was the main bottom line for the World Bank in the 60s and 70s. But despite that, the levels are still far from what is needed in most African countries. So the current picture in terms of Africa's infrastructure deficits, finance deficits, is actually really, really worrying. But let's see what happens. I mean, it's still early days to see that as a structural, clear decline for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, let's get the live audience. Who would like to go next? There's one here. There's one there, and one at the front. And I think that might actually be us done then.
Thank you very much for this great work.
It's the woman at the back. Sorry, keep going, keep going.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very enlightening. I had a few questions.
Is the mic working?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I think it doesn't sound like that.
Speak up.
Is it better?
Yeah,
it's way better.
Beautiful.
So thank you very much for your presentation. It was I liked it a lot. I had a few questions, but more on the side of China. What does the Chinese researcher, the Chinese government, and the Chinese entrepreneur think about this global China? Do they think it has some kind of Chinese exceptionalism that they are going to win forever and so on? Or do they see it as in a different way, like I don't know, what does the Chinese think about it? And no, that's pretty much it for the question, I think. It's already broad.
So the woman back there, yeah? Can somebody pass that? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do introduce yourself so we know where you're coming from.
Yeah, my name is Idan. I'm a PhD student here at SOAS. And my research is actually on global China in France, in Paris. I previously done more research on African studies, so I always have this in-between perspective. And my question is related to Professor Ching Kwan's what you said about the theory. There are many current theories in the social science that the researchers in the global China should use. I'm a bit struggling with that because I always tend to use some theories. Well, when I was doing African root studies, when I was in Africa, I was also having this moments of, okay, this theory might not apply exactly here, but I don't know what that is. And I was encouraged by a lot of African scholars who trained me to develop a new language or a new theory that might depart from some of the existing theories. So I want to know your thoughts on this because I know there are a lot of like nuances here. But yeah, that was my question.
Okay, thank you. And
Thank you.
we can have, is there one more? Thank you. I like this cooperation here.
I'm Casper, one postgraduate student here, and I'm also one postgraduate student practitioner and researcher on the charities, foundations, and social politics in China. Professor Jing Jun just talked about the repressive into China, and our Professor Congress referred to the failures and conflicts in many China projects out of China. So my question is, does the failures and conflicts are they related to the nation capacity on governing the society of China? Of Beijing, for example, I know many global China companies are looking for consulting services on CSI, ESG, and community issues from British companies, but not from China companies. But do they have relativeness? That's the failures related to the capacity of China on civil society.
Yeah, can you simplify the question a bit?
Okay. Professor Carlos talked about some failures projects in Africa, and King Huan talks about that China is under repressive internal China. So I want to figure out that's the failures and community conflicts into Africa. The China's projects in Africa is related to the capacity building of governing civil society of China governments.
It's a very complex question.
Yeah.
Not catching.
Okay.
I think what he's trying to say is can experiences of negotiation happening in African countries.
Can they come back to?
What negotiation?
The negotiation, the labor negotiation, or
The conflict with
the
communities.
conflict negotiations happening in global China setting brought back to the Chinese setting.
Okay.
I mean, internal setting.
For relations between the state and civil society.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's the same question as
It's
you
it's
had.
very similar. Yeah.
They're very similar.
Labor and community.
Yes, yes.
That's
Very interesting. Should we take one more? Do you think we can
Yeah.
have time for
we
one
get
more?
more question. We may not be able to
So,
answer, but.
okay, just this one last one. Sorry, you were the fastest.
Two more.
Two more, okay. Two more. We do have to, we get kicked out in about 10 minutes, so. Yes.
Just tell us your thoughts. We may not be able to-
Microphone. You're
Me?
right.
Is it
Okay,
me?
let's go.
Hi, I'm Max Duncan. I'm a filmmaker. I made a documentary in Ethiopia. I consulted a lot of Carlos's research. It was fantastic. Oh, thank you. My question is about public perceptions in the global south of global China. And in what way are they changing? Because I think you would think that as China's contribution grows, you would see more positive public perceptions, but at the same time, as it's more present, you see more media responses and potentially negative perceptions. So I'm interested if you see across the global south trends in public perceptions. Thanks.
Good. And now I've lost track. Who was it? Ah, yes, you and you. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jing Yi, PhD student from King's College London, Department of International Development. So I'm a Chinese scholar working on India, and in my research, I feel that I do notice the China exceptionalism. So I turn to India. That's a kind of a way. But I feel like, do you think we can push the research agenda further by thinking more on because India and China, they are two countries of very large scale, more than 2 billion people. And I feel like they have more similarities compared to global north. So I'm wondering whether we can push the agenda further by thinking of a theory based on this kind of like BRIC countries, and also maintain the dialogue with the global north and under the context of neoliberalism. So that's kind of the research agenda question. That's it. Thank you.
Last question as well. Very good. Last one. You have the last word.
Yeah, my name is Alfian from Indonesia. I want to ask Professor Ching Kwan or Professor Carlos on, now we see that Chinese investment bring factory to America, to Europe, Western Europe, like this country have better standard wages, regulations, while in Africa, in Indonesia, no. And many Chinese investment in Indonesia and Africa, they don't care about wages, about union. So in this Western liberal country, do they have different culture or different approach toward workplace? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, well, very quickly, when China invests in the North, of course, they have to abide by those regulations regarding labor, environment, and the rest of it. So that is empirical in the case. And that's why, my response to this question about community pressure, whether that would travel back to China or labor negotiation that would travel back to China, I think it depends on the institutional environment in different countries. So, it's not like it's really have to be determined by those objective factors. It's not culture floating around. And there's no mechanism, unless you can tell me or show me the mechanisms for culture to travel from one place to another. And when you try to do that, I think most of the time you'll realize that it's really institutional pressures, regulations from the state, and power, whether they can push, whether community capacity. If you have very weak community power, weak civil society, then the Chinese would just ignore you, like any other investors would ignore you. So it's not about whether it's Chinese, whether it's China or outside, and how this culture will flow around. I think we need to really take a hard look at the institutional arrangement and the power configuration, rather than isolating this thing called culture. I know it's the easiest thing to pinpoint, and everything is just about how these people are. As if there's some personality with these managers, and they would travel back with a different personality because of the new experience. No, I think you don't look at the people. You look at people as the result of some institutional arrangement. Our behavior, our interests are shaped by society and the system in which we find ourselves. So that's my response to both questions. And very quickly, the perception of the South, and this is a very interesting question, global South on global China. Well, obviously, we need to differentiate who we are talking about, right, in the South. Are we talking about those workers directly employed by the Chinese? Or are we talking about general population in China or policymakers? But I want to point out something, because it's related to my new research. I think the ordinary people has now, in many parts of the global South, appreciated Chinese development and presence as what? As consumers. And that is something that people haven't picked up on that much. Not just the cheap goods that even poor people in the South could purchase because Chinese goods are affordable, but also when we look at the middle class in Africa or Latin America, for instance, or even in Indonesia, the single most sought after commodity that make them feel they're part of modernity is what? Is an electric vehicle. And China is big on green tech and green consumer products, and BYD has brought a lot of people their dreams of having a car that is green, give them mobility, and is affordable. And I think consumption, we do development studies, we never theorize enough how consumption work in and mass consumption. What they want is not GDP growth in the abstract. What people want is really something that they can consume in their life immediately, and that will translate into political pressure on policymakers and the perception of foreign investment. And China is winning big among policymakers because China helped them pursue and realize the decarbonization agenda to reindustrialize, and for ordinary people, an immediate commodity to consume and make them feel that they are not left behind, they're not some poor third world, population, but on equal footing. And that is the dignity part that I think we need to take into account, and the consumption part, and how that really, for people practicing development policies, we need to satisfy them. And no matter how critical we are about their views, or their short-term consumption is not going to, doing long-term structural change. Nobody cares about structural change except us. Ordinary folks, you give them an EV, that is what they really want. They have been deprived for so many years. I mean, I study Africa and really talk to a lot of African people, and they can tell you 1,000 things that the Chinese are bringing to them. And they know the Chinese have their own agenda, but they like that road that the Chinese built, because guess what? When the Chinese leave, the road stays. As simple as that. And so we need to development studies. We need to really take into account third world people, what they want. And your question really is addressing this. In the West, they try to demonize China in so many different ways, but they never talk to local people. What exactly attracts them to China? And it's really material things, and the green future and green industrialization that China is giving them big opportunities. Now, the reality, of course, is more complicated than that. I'm the last one to be so friendly to the Chinese, but I have to give them that. At least they lay that foundation, and there are lots of different politics that Carlos will illustrate. It will vary in many, many different ways in different countries. How do these countries, their government, leverage the Chinese presence and the Chinese supply chain that they try to learn, and the Chinese are trying to help them build part of supply chain, but not the full supply chain, because otherwise then there is no road for China. So there's a lot of interesting politics along those lines. But I think consumption is an absolutely important theoretical category to rework a lot of development themes. And so it's too long an answer to your question, but that's a great question.
Great answer.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree on the point of different practices. You just need to understand, what is the bargaining power of workers in different contexts, the labor institution operates in. I will just give you an anecdotal example, which we found in Angola and Ethiopia, that not just Chinese firms, but people matter Chinese firms. Managers, first thing they did when arriving was, can we have a copy of the labor law, number one? And can we understand whether the labor law is actually implemented? So in a sense, I mean, what is a bit surprising, to be honest, in those contexts was the extent to which many firms, especially managers, lacked the international experience. That's perhaps one of the, and they went into very, very new contexts, a little bit in the dark, not really knowing what was the institutional context, etc., which meant that both in Ethiopia and Angola, where we looked at these things more closely, you could see the adaptation unfolding over time. The way they were operating in 2016, 17 was very different from the way they operate now. Really understanding how to navigate not just relations with workers or with unions, but also with the government officials, and negotiating these spaces as part of that contestation that needs to be understood. So the same will happen in the European context. I mean, they would know why they invest in Europe, but I'm sure that they know that the standards are different. And they will have mechanisms to adapt, because the bottom line is why they want to be in the European market. That's the priority. So they will adapt everything else to that goal. Just a quick comment on the theories. I don't know whether I got your point well, but my only comment to that would be, in the social sciences, you do have a vast array of different theories. So I would agree that, yes, if you have been trained in a particular theoretical tradition, say very mainstream tradition, especially if you're an economist or political sciences, that you might feel that that doesn't quite fit the context in which you're doing your research, and you need something different. But we do have, all kinds of alternatives that do not necessarily map into what is now called decolonized knowledge, comes before that as well. So it's just a question of where the training goes, what kind of training people are getting in universities, and whether you are, very much limited in the range of theoretical perspective to which you are exposed. So that certainly is a problem. And that is a problem that particularly affects those researchers who go and do serious fieldwork, but then they realize that it's trouble.
My last point to you, two questions about theory, India, China, and then you're doing, in Paris, right? I think I can't answer those questions because I'm not getting what phenomenon you are studying. Before you think about theories, first of all, define what exactly is the phenomenon that you're studying. So between China and India, there's so many things. I don't know what you're talking about, and what theories you are relevant. And the same with you about Paris, France, China, France. What do you want to? What is the phenomenon? Okay, I think this is it's such a simple question. It's not so simple, and so I understand that you may not be able to clarify the object of analysis. And only when you have an object of analysis, what exactly? Don't use this country as the question, because that is just too general. You can't do a research about India and China on what you need to specify, right? Global China in Paris. What? People? Are you talking about people? Are you talking about company? Are you talking about particular sector? About government relations with all the migration? Once you have the phenomenon, then you look for theories about migration, theories about whatever. And then you begin to think, does size matter, for instance, in your case? Big countries, small countries? In what ways? What are the mechanisms that size matter? That is when you narrow down the field. You may need to look at some demography field, right? But size itself doesn't bring India and China together, in my view. It's not theoretical. And so I think the first step for researchers in the room is to be able to name the phenomenon that you're studying. And don't let empirical entities like people, company, those are not the phenomenon. Those are observable objects, but they're not a phenomenon. A phenomenon needs to be constituted conceptually. And a lot of times there are theories behind those concepts that lead you to see this person, this company as a case of something. You need to tell me what this case is that you're interested. Why are you interested in Paris? Why are you interested in the comparison between China and India about what? That is the phenomenon. Once you determine that, then you will be able to see what other theories that are relevant from the general literature and whether it makes sense to make country size a theoretical variable in particular situations, but not others. In some cases, but not others.
And as we go into the MSc dissertation season, I thank you very much for exactly that. Thank you.